Hello from London. I'm Andy Cowlitz. Now that Life Beyond the Gods has been read for a year by readers on each of the 6 continents, I wondered how some of the great thinkers would have responded to the book. So I asked ChatGPT to provide a critique of Life Beyond the Gods through the books, the podcasts, the speeches, and the YouTube videos of these thinkers. These 37 thinkers represent a global spectrum, originating from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas, and reflect some very, very diverse outlooks. There's a list of the thinkers on your screen, so feel free to fast forward to your reference go-to thinkers for their views. Each thinker is briefly introduced at the bottom of their image. All the critiques were written as if the thinker is still alive through his or her own work. First, I asked for a critique of Life Beyond the Gods through the works of a number of well-known existentialists and absurdists who wrestle with life's meaning, with freedom, and with responsibility after rejecting divine authority.
Friedrich Nietzsche would greet Life Beyond the Gods with respect for its intellectual boldness, seeing in it a rare determination to confront the inherited illusions shaping Western morality for centuries. Rejecting divine authority here is not a casual gesture, but a deliberate act of philosophical defiance, placing you among those willing to challenge tradition and accept the solitude that comes with such a stance. He would agree that courage is needed to confront inherited illusions. Nietzsche would suspect your secular ethics remains bound to virtues shaped by Judeo-Christian morality. He would argue that you preserve values which restrain instinct and the will to power, instead of moving fully beyond good and evil into a new moral horizon. Andy, you've slain the gods, but kept their commandments. Jean-Paul Sartre would commend the existential courage in Life Beyond the Gods, seeing in your work a deliberate break from the comforts of divine command. For him, rejecting God means taking full responsibility for the meaning and direction of one's life, without appealing to any higher authority. This act places you among those willing to stand alone in shaping existence through choice and action. He would agree with your rejection of divine command as enabling freedom and responsibility. Sartre would challenge its latent moralism. He might argue that while you reject divine command, you retain a residue of essentialism, still searching for a universal moral path. For Sartre, once God is rejected, one must embrace radical freedom without looking back. Andy, you escaped the gods, but you still carry their guilt. Albert Camus would recognize in Life Beyond the Gods a rejection of false consolation, and an embrace of truthfulness. He would admire your commitment to living lucidly without illusions, choosing honesty over comforting but unfounded beliefs. In this, he would see a kinship with his own call for living fully in the face of life's absurdity, without recourse to the divine. He would agree that authentic living without illusions is worth pursuing. Camus would caution against existential paralysis. He might view the work as noble in its skepticism yet hesitant in its affirmation. For Camus, rejecting the gods should lead to defiant engagement with life, embracing its joys and challenges without hope of ultimate meaning. Andy, to live without God is not a tragedy, it is a freedom. Dare to embrace it. Michel Foucault would see value in your rejection of religious authority as a necessary step toward dismantling entrenched power structures. He would appreciate your recognition of how belief systems shape human subjectivity and influence the exercise of power over individuals and societies. This move aligns with his own project of unmasking the mechanisms that govern and normalize behavior. He would agree that power structures survive beyond religion and must be confronted. Foucault would argue that your work remains within disciplinary mechanisms inherited from religion. He might suggest that while you have shifted from priestly authority to self-governance, the same patterns of control still persist, shaping behavior in subtle ways that limit genuine autonomy. Andy, you've exiled the gods, but kept their prisons. Slavoj Žižek would appreciate your willingness to challenge the illusions of religion, and interrogate the ideological role of the sacred. He would see in your approach a refusal to be comforted by myths, instead urging a deeper examination of the structures that sustain belief even after its supposed disappearance. He would agree that belief structures shift rather than disappear completely. Žižek would argue that the symbolic frameworks of the gods still underpin your thinking. He might claim the ghosts of the sacred continue to haunt your moral vision, subtly shaping its structure even in the absence of explicit faith or theological grounding. Andy, your gods are dead, but their ghosts write your chapters.
Julia Kristeva would value your recognition of the human longing for meaning and your willingness to explore emotional depth without doctrinal constraints. She would appreciate your engagement with the inner life as something worthy of attention even in the absence of divine reference. She would agree that language carries deep cultural and religious imprints. Kristeva might argue that your secular language retains liturgical resonances. She would caution that even after the gods are gone, the symbolic forms of desire they shaped can persist, influencing emotional and moral frameworks in ways that may not be immediately visible. Andy, your language is secular, but your longing is liturgical.
Requested critiques from religious ethical voices, upholding moral frameworks grounded in faith traditions, integrating spiritual conviction with ethical guidance for human life.
Thomas Aquinas would admire your reliance on reasoned argument and moral reflection, recognizing the importance of rational inquiry in guiding ethical life. He would respect your willingness to use intellect as the primary tool for moral reasoning, placing emphasis on logic and deliberation as a means of discerning right action in human affairs. He would agree that reason is a vital tool in the moral life. Aquinas would argue that you have severed ethics from its divine foundation. Without orientation toward God, he would say, moral reasoning risks becoming relative and unable to bind the will toward its proper end, union with the divine source of all goodness. Andy, you've built a fine road, but refuse to see where it leads. Raimon Panikkar was a Spanish Indian theologian, philosopher, bridge between religions and cultures. He would value your openness to plural perspectives and your willingness to find meaning beyond rigid religious doctrine. He would see in your work a respect for the many ways humans experience transcendence, even outside formal belief systems. He would agree that meaning exists outside dogma in relationships. Panikkar might argue that your approach risks reducing transcendence to purely human constructs. For him, transcendence continually takes new forms and should not be confined to secular interpretations alone, lest it lose its transformative power and depth. Andy, transcendence does not end when religion fades, it finds new forms. Pope Francis would appreciate your emphasis on compassion and moral responsibility toward others. He would respect your desire to promote kindness and care as guiding ethical principles for a more humane society. He would agree with your concern for compassion and care for others. Francis would contend that you have overlooked the divine source of compassion. Without God, he would argue, the light you seek is incomplete, lacking the grace that animates it and the sacred depth that sustains it over time. Andy, you speak of compassion, but forget its source. You seek light, but reject the sun. Sheikh Abdallah bin Bayar would respect your call for justice, mercy, and accountability as foundations of moral life. He would appreciate your recognition that these principles are indispensable for social harmony. He would agree that justice, mercy, and accountability are essential. Bin Bayar would ask who will speak for these values without God's authority. For him, divine law provides the necessary anchor, ensuring that justice and mercy are upheld without succumbing to shifting human preferences or political pressures. Andy, you have silenced God, but who then speaks for justice, mercy, and law? The Dalai Lama would value your intent to foster kindness and reduce suffering. He would appreciate your advocacy for compassion as an active force for human well-being and peace. He would agree that kindness and reducing suffering are central aims. The Dalai Lama might say that without mindfulness and liberation from attachment, compassion remains incomplete. He would urge adding a spiritual dimension to match ethical aims, enabling deeper transformation of self and society. Andy, you discarded belief, but what about compassion, mindfulness, and liberation from suffering? Charles Taylor would appreciate your exploration of meaning in a secular age. He would acknowledge your insight into the human search for purpose beyond the bounds of traditional religion. He would agree that the search for meaning continues in secular contexts. Taylor might caution that your framework overlooks the richness offered by religious imagination and practice, which still holds profound resonance for many and can deepen moral and existential insight. Andy, you've left belief, but still dwell in the house of longing. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks would value your ethical concern for community and mutual responsibility. He would see in your work a moral commitment to the well-being of others and to the bonds that hold societies together. He would agree that ethics should be grounded in responsibility to others. Sacks might note that by abandoning the covenant, you risk losing the binding narrative that has historically shaped these responsibilities and sustained them across generations. Andy, you've abandoned the covenant, but not the questions that shaped it.
Karen Armstrong would appreciate your emphasis on compassion as central to ethical living, seeing it as a virtue that transcends cultures and beliefs. She would acknowledge the resolve required to uphold compassion without divine command, recognizing in your approach a commitment to kindness as a universal and unifying moral principle. She would agree that ethical living requires compassion and courage. Armstrong might argue you underestimate the role of religious traditions in cultivating compassion, embedding it in stories, rituals, and moral frameworks guiding communities for centuries. She would stress these traditions preserve the virtue's depth, provide continuity, and offer a cultural structure for sustaining moral growth across generations. Andy, you left the church, but took the silence with you. Ayaan Hirsi Ali would respect your courage in leaving inherited dogma, recognizing the personal risk and independence required to break with deeply ingrained traditions. She would note your willingness to think freely, challenge authority, and speak openly about your conclusions, placing you among those who confront systems of belief not just in theory, but in the lived reality of personal choice. She would agree that courage is required to abandon entrenched religious belief. Hirsi Ali, now a Christian, might question whether rejecting faith altogether can provide the depth of meaning and moral grounding she has found in her conversion. She would suggest that Christianity offers a richer foundation for values you prize, one rooted in both cultural heritage and spiritual purpose. Andy, you search for meaning, but overlook the enduring power of faith to anchor it.
Next, we listen to the critiques from the work of outspoken secular humanists and atheists, whose critiques arise from reason, from autonomy, and from freedom from divine authority.
Joseph Lewis would welcome your decision to reject divine authority and speak openly about it, seeing in your stance a shared dedication to clarity and truth in matters of belief. He would value your willingness to state your convictions plainly and encourage others to think critically about inherited doctrines and their influence on moral life. He would agree with your desire for clarity and honesty about religion. Lewis would criticize what he sees as too restrained a tone, urging you to denounce religion with greater passion and force. He would argue that only through strong, uncompromising speech can the influence of harmful beliefs be diminished and replaced with reason-based ethics. Andy, if you've left the gods, say it with fire, not with footnotes.
Ayn Rand would value your rejection of supernaturalism and your commitment to human autonomy, recognizing in your position an alignment with her own emphasis on rational self-determination. She would note your choice to define morality without religious constraints as a positive step toward empowering the individual as the highest moral authority. She would affirm your stance in favor of self-determination over divine command. Rand would challenge your emphasis on compassion and collective responsibility, which she would see as remnants of altruism undermining personal excellence. For her, moral life should serve the pursuit of individual achievement and self-interest, not the needs of others, which she views as secondary to one's own flourishing. Andy, this book portrays man's greatness with soft collectivist sentimentality.
Richard Dawkins would support your aim to base morality on reason and evidence, seeing in your work an ally in the effort to free ethics from theological control. He would commend your readiness to trust human rationality and empirical knowledge as the basis for moral decision-making. He would agree with your view that ethics can be grounded without divine sanction. Dawkins might say you underuse science to strengthen your case, missing an opportunity to show how evolutionary biology and natural selection can explain moral instincts. He would argue that a robust scientific foundation would make your arguments harder to challenge from religious perspectives. Andy, you shed the gods, but still bow to their shadows. Daniel Dennett would value your effort to examine religion as a natural human phenomenon, seeing in your approach a willingness to treat belief systems as products of culture and cognition. He would respect your aim to illuminate the psychological and social mechanisms that support religious thought. He would concur with your view that religion can be understood without appealing to the supernatural. Dennett might argue that you did not fully analyze how people transition out of belief, leaving your account incomplete. He would urge you to provide a more detailed model of the process by which individuals free themselves from religious frameworks and embrace secular reasoning. Andy, you've exited the church, but forgot to model the exit. Christopher Hitchens would applaud your rejection of divine authority and your willingness to confront religious influence directly. He would see in your work a shared resolve to challenge not just belief but also the institutions that perpetuate it. He would endorse your goal of exposing the harms and falsehoods of religion. Hitchens might urge you to be more combative, arguing that dismantling belief requires dismantling its structures and privileges. He would encourage a sharper critique aimed at removing religion's power over politics, education, and public discourse. Andy, leave the gods, but burn the temples too. Michel Onfray would support your aim to construct a moral vision without religious foundations, recognizing in it a parallel to his own philosophical project. He would commend your determination to locate meaning and ethics within human experience rather than divine command. He would agree with your commitment to meaning without divine authority. Onfray might suggest you still retain ethical structures shaped by Christian morality, even after rejecting its doctrines. He would argue that a truly post-religious ethic must question and, where necessary, abandon these inherited moral assumptions in order to create a fully emancipated framework. Andy, you left the church, but still kneel in its shadow. Sam Harris would value your rejection of supernatural beliefs and your emphasis on ethical reasoning. He would note your alignment with his own belief that morality can be grounded in human well-being without religious justification. He would affirm your belief in cultivating ethics without divine command. Harris might argue that you underdevelop the role of consciousness and mental discipline in sustaining a moral life. He would encourage incorporating practices such as meditation and mindfulness as tools for fostering ethical clarity and emotional balance. Andy, you left belief but haven't quite embraced consciousness.
Critique would be complete without the views of mystics and spiritual reformers, emphasizing inner transformation, direct experience, and transcendent insights beyond institutional religion or very rigid dogma.
Eckhart Tolle would appreciate your rejection of rigid dogma and your openness to personal transformation, recognizing these as important steps toward living with greater authenticity and freedom. He would see in your work a shared interest in moving beyond inherited mental structures to find a deeper connection with the essence of life. He would affirm your belief that personal transformation is necessary for a meaningful life. Tolle might argue that you still focus too heavily on the thinking mind, neglecting present moment awareness as a path to freedom from suffering. He would encourage integrating mindfulness into your approach, seeing it as essential for realizing the peace and clarity that sustain ethical living. Andy, you let go of the gods, but not of the mind that created them. Sadhguru would value your move beyond traditional religious constraints in search of truth, recognizing the independence of thought it represents. He would respect your desire to pursue self-awareness as a means of deepening both personal and societal well-being. He would agree with your recognition that the inward journey to self-awareness is essential. Sadhguru might say that transcending the gods is not true liberation if you fail to transcend your own limitations and ego. He would stress the importance of inner transformation as the real source of freedom, beyond symbolic or doctrinal change. Andy, transcending gods is not liberation if you forget to transcend yourself.
Now we turn to the critiques from political and moral activists, fighting for justice, rights, and human dignity, linking ethics to social change and historical struggle.
Shunsuke Tsurumi would appreciate your concern for the individual's search for meaning in a post-religious age, recognizing your effort to connect ethical life with historical and cultural awareness. He would value your understanding that moral identity is shaped by more than personal choice alone. He would affirm your belief that history and collective experience shape ethical identity. Tsurumi might warn that ignoring the traumas carried by the collective risks misunderstanding the individual's identity and purpose. He would advocate a deeper engagement with shared historical memory as a means of grounding personal moral responsibility. Andy, to forget the trauma of the collective is to misunderstand the individual. Noam Chomsky would value your commitment to questioning authority and advocating justice, recognizing the moral integrity behind your challenges to entrenched systems of power. He would see your critique of religious authority as part of a broader project to expose and resist harmful hierarchies. He would agree with your belief that power and authority must be examined critically. Chomsky might say your ethics lack sufficient engagement with the political and economic forces shaping human life. He would argue that without this dimension, moral critique risks remaining abstract and detached from the realities of structural injustice. Andy, ethics divorced from power analysis is sentiment without substance. Amartya Sen would support your emphasis on justice, education, and equality as ethical imperatives, recognizing these as foundations for human flourishing. He would commend your insistence that well-being should be measured by real freedoms rather than abstract ideals. He would concur with your view that human flourishing requires justice and equality. Sen might argue that your framework does not adequately address the structural conditions necessary for these values to thrive. He would encourage a stronger focus on social and institutional reforms that expand opportunities for all. Andy, freedom of thought means opening the mind, not just closing the scriptures.
Martha Nussbaum would appreciate your moral vision and your emphasis on dignity, recognizing these as central to the development of a just and compassionate society. She would see your work as aligned with her own commitment to the capabilities approach, focusing on human potential. She would affirm your conviction that ethics must include empathy and dignity for all. Nussbaum might caution that your framework does not sufficiently account for those excluded from the search for meaning. She would argue for greater attention to marginalized voices, ensuring that the pursuit of ethical life is inclusive. Andy, you search for meaning, but forget to ask who is excluded from the search.
Cornel West would value your moral vision and its engagement with human dignity, seeing in it a kinship with his own prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power. He would recognize your desire to connect ethics to compassion and justice. He would agree with your belief that moral vision must address the suffering of the marginalized. West might say your work remains incomplete without active prophetic action in solidarity with the oppressed. He would urge translating moral conviction into concrete action for justice. Andy, you left the church pew, but not the suffering behind. What will you do with it? Liu Xiaobo would admire your advocacy for freedom of thought and rejection of imposed dogma, seeing in it a courage akin to resistance against political oppression. He would value your insistence on moral courage as a guiding principle. He would concur with your view that moral courage is essential under oppressive systems. Liu might warn that without spiritual courage, freedom risks becoming another form of conformity. He would encourage a deeper moral resilience that transcends both fear and societal expectation. Andy, freedom without spiritual courage is just another form of conformity. To go beyond the gods is also to go beyond fear. Akile Mbembe would value your rejection of divine authority and your interest in secular ethics, recognizing its relevance to contemporary African and post-colonial thought. He would commend your attention to the political dimensions of meaning. He would agree with your belief that political and historical realities shape the search for meaning. Mbembe might argue that you have not sufficiently addressed how colonialism and empire continue to influence moral frameworks. He would encourage a more explicit engagement with these legacies in shaping ethics today. Andy, you speak of freedom from the gods, but not from the empires that built them.
We also hear critiques from postmodernists and deconstructionists, questioning truth, language, meaning, and dismantling rigid structures to reveal complexity underlying power relations in our society.
Jacques Derrida would appreciate your willingness to question inherited structures and assumptions, recognizing in your work an effort to deconstruct the metaphysical frameworks that have shaped Western thought. He would see your challenge to religious authority as part of a broader inquiry into how meaning is constructed and sustained. He would agree with your belief that challenging underlying metaphysics is valuable. Derrida might point out that your rejection of metaphysics is itself a deeply metaphysical gesture, illustrating the difficulty of escaping the very structures you critique. He would urge a greater awareness of this paradox, suggesting that recognizing it might enrich rather than weaken your argument. Andy, you reject metaphysics, through a very metaphysical gesture. John D. Caputo would value your openness to uncertainty and to living without rigid absolutes, recognizing in it a shared appreciation for the fluidity of meaning. He would see your approach as willing to embrace the risks of ambiguity. He would affirm your belief that meaning should remain open to new possibilities. Caputo might argue that you present your position too conclusively, closing off the radical openness that keeps responsibility alive. He would encourage you to preserve the element of surprise and the potential for ethical transformation that uncertainty allows. Andy, you escaped the church, but still crave its certainties. Bruno Latour would appreciate your acknowledgement that ethics and meaning exist within interconnected systems, recognizing the complexity of the networks that sustain moral life. He would value your willingness to think beyond individualism toward relational frameworks. He would concur with your belief that meaning emerges in complex, interdependent relationships. Lato might say you have cleared away old narratives without fully replacing the actors who animate the stage of ethical life. He would argue that without these active agents, the ethical landscape risks becoming static and incomplete. Andy, you cleaned the stage, but left the actors behind.
And finally, we listen to individualists and rationalists defending self-determination, critical reasoning, and intellectual clarity as guiding principles for a purposeful, autonomous life.
Ludwig Wittgenstein would value your awareness of how language shapes moral understanding, recognizing the central role of linguistic context in philosophical reflection. He would see your work as attentive to the limits of expression. He would agree with your belief that moral and philosophical reasoning are embedded in linguistic contexts. Wittgenstein might say you are still playing the same language game shaped by religious tradition, even after claiming to move beyond it. He would urge a deeper examination of how inherited language constrains new thought. Andy, you play with meaning, but forget the language game you're in. You think you are beyond the gods, but you still speak their language. Galen Strawson would appreciate your rejection of metaphysical ideas about the soul, recognizing this as a step toward a more naturalistic understanding of human identity. He would see your work as grounded in the realities of lived experience. He would agree with your view that a divinely ordained soul is unnecessary for moral life. Strawson might argue that you still hold too tightly to the notion of a persistent self. He would encourage loosening this attachment to better align with the fluid nature of consciousness. Andy, you abandoned the soul, but still cling to the self. Jordan Peterson would respect your courage in questioning inherited traditions, viewing it as an act of intellectual independence and moral risk-taking. He would recognize your readiness to stand apart from prevailing norms and challenge accepted narratives about the source of meaning and order in human life. He would agree with your recognition that archetypal wisdom embedded in tradition has shaped human culture. Peterson might argue that by discarding these traditions without a clear replacement, you risk leaving a vacuum of meaning and order. He would press for building a sustaining framework that offers the depth and stability tradition once provided. Andy, you tear down the cathedral but offer no architecture of meaning in its place.
So there you have it, your view of life beyond the gods, and 37 other views from selected critics. From an author's perspective, the capability that now exists to generate an independent critique from this wide group of eminent critics is extremely valuable. I hope you found it valuable and interesting too.